Hello and welcome to ECMI Conversations with Experts series. This is episode 4, and today I have as my guest James Ker-Lindsay. I'm Marika Jolai, Senior Researcher and Head of Conflict and Security Cluster. And my guest is, to say at least, expert in the field. James Ker-Lindsay is visiting professor at the European Institute, London School of Economics, and he's also research associate at the Center for International Studies, Oxford University. His research focuses on conflict, peace, and security in Southeast Europe, and on secession and recognition in international politics. James is not just an academic, he's also a practitioner, and he has carried out a number of tasks and assignments in the advisory role as analyst, as a mediator in conflicts, especially in Cyprus, over the years. And he's certainly someone who is a strong believer in the importance of public engagement by the academic community. He thinks and believes that the knowledge should be made available to wider audiences. And he has his own YouTube channel exploring international relations and conflict and conflict analysis. So James, I'm delighted to have you today with me. And I would like to ask you, first and foremost, it's been a difficult year for everyone around the world, but we have seen some conflicts flaring up. So what would you say, what would your comment be about that? What are the reasons? What are the consequences?
Well, Mary, thank you so much for this really kind invite to appear, and it's lovely to be talking to you like this. Obviously we've known each other for a long time. So yeah, 2020 is definitely going to go down in history for all sorts of reasons. I mean, apart from COVID, I think we have seen some very dramatic developments on the world stage, and I think in the field of conflict, the real standout story, I think, to my mind, is of course Nagorno-Karabakh and the war that we saw between Armenia and Azerbaijan there. And this was something that I think a lot of people had felt was a very real possibility that we could see a flare-up of fighting there. We saw something a little early in the year, and there was a sense that this so-called frozen conflict was ripe to escalate, but I don't think anyone was expecting to see what we saw with the start of the war, and also how quickly that war ended, and the circumstances under which it ended. There was a lot of fear that this could have led to horrific death toll in the end, that there could have been very, very serious human rights abuses, potential for ethnic cleansing, genocide even. And, I know this is a very controversial idea, but this was something that a lot in the international community felt was a possibility, and in the end that was averted. But strangely enough, we moved from one type of frozen conflict there to another, so maybe we can talk about that a bit later. But I think in many ways that was the big story in this. But I think also one of the things that I've become very aware of is I've spent years working on Southeast Europe, is just how big a world there is out there that is often ignored. That the media coverage tends to be very Eurocentric, and obviously North American focused as well. And one of the other big conflicts, which again had potentially huge ramifications, and I don't think we know exactly where it's quite going to go, is a place called Tigray, which is in northern Ethiopia. And the reason I think that that's so significant is because, Ethiopia is an enormous country. It's 110 million people. It's the second most populous country in Africa. It's very multi-ethnic. And for those of us, who've worked on the Balkans, I mean, often people will sort of have the comparison with the Balkans and Yugoslavia. You've got a constitution that technically and officially, it's actually a very rare constitution that allows secession, but it's never been tested. And so there's all sorts of ethnic disputes and conflicts which have been simmering. But then suddenly we saw this major conflict in the northernmost province of Tigray. And that was something which, if that set off a chain reaction in Ethiopia, and the government says it's now got the matter under control, but it's not clear that that is actually the case. Then you could see, if you saw a situation, I'm wary of these comparisons, but a situation that we saw in the Balkans in the 1990s replicated in East Africa, in a country of 110 million people, it doesn't take a lot to realize just how dangerous that would be, not only for a very fragile region as a whole, but the spin-off ramifications that this could have right up into Europe as well, because obviously we'd be talking massive population flows. So that's been another issue. So those, I think, are the two. There are other smaller conflicts that emerge, but I think those, to my mind, have been the two really big issues that we've seen this year.
So would you say that there is a connection between having minorities in a state and conflict emergence? I know you worked for a long time. You also worked on Kosovo, which we can touch upon later, Cyprus, Northern Cyprus as well. So how do you see link between minorities and conflict?
This is such an interesting question. It's obviously very, it's a very difficult question to answer in many ways, because, we can say that a large number of conflicts seem to revolve around civil disputes which are focused on minorities. So there's a natural tendency to think that, countries with minority communities are naturally prone to conflict. But of course, if you take a step back and realize that, I can't remember the exact number, but I think we could be potentially talking the fingers of two hands, the number of countries which we can consider to be ethnically homogenous. The question then becomes, why is it that this small number of countries with minorities, considering that the vast majority of the world states do have national minorities of one sort or another, are peaceful and they don't resort to conflict? So I think it's one of those sort of situations that when you look at it firsthand, it appears really, as I say, countries which have minority communities more prone to conflict. But when you take a step back, you realize, well, that's not actually the case.
One of the things that a number of authors or experts are arguing in their work is that it is about access to power, and that minorities have or don't have, and ultimately which gives them leverage to have influence or to have just a say in the countries where they live. Do you think that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, this is such an interesting point because, for example, if you look at some of the literature on peaceful societies, and, there aren't a lot of those peaceful societies around the world. But traditionally, one of the things they've said is that, these are societies where it's very flat level of decision making, and people feel involved in those decision-making processes, that there's a very high degree of access to it. Now, the response would be, well, that works very nicely for small societies, but how can you manage that in big modern societies? But I think that this is one of those questions which is incredibly important, and how that might be able to address some of these difficulties. I was watching, for example, a few days ago, The Economist had a very, very interesting video on, sort of representative democracy versus participative democracy, and how a move to this greater use of participation, things like citizens' assemblies, can actually help decision makers and make people feel far more involved in decision and make sure that their voices are heard, and that how this can sometimes chart a way forward, even for very, very emotionally charged issues where there are deep divisions in society. And so I think, this is obviously one of those areas where we would need to be thinking, how can we utilize the changes that are taking place to make people feel more involved in society. But one thing I would say that I tend to get very, very nervous about as a general rule, and I know that people will often say it in the most well-meaning of senses, but for example, on Cyprus, the number of times I've heard people say to me, well, why can't they just all be Cypriots? That would just solve the matter. If they're all Cypriots. And I feel distinctly uncomfortable with that, because I think there needs to be room for people to be able to express a different identity. I don't think that that's a bad thing in itself. I think we should all celebrate diversity, things like languages, for example, and just simply pushing for homogeneity as the way to solve this problem. I don't like. I think maybe it might be my own British background. So I have a very, very Scottish surname. On my mother's side, I have Welsh ancestry. My late grandmother, who sadly died this year, was a native Welsh speaker. Sadly, I never was taught the language, but I would hate the idea that Britishness was boiled down, as it so often is, to Englishness. Now, I'm actually half English, but from mother and father's side, it gets a bit confusing. But the point is, I would not like a Britain that is synonymous with Englishness. I love the fact that there is Scotland in this, and I love the fact that there is Wales in there, and that diversity. So I get very, very nervous about this idea that we solve these problems by resorting to an overarching national identity, largely because in many of these cases, that overarching national identity will be for one ethnic group, which inevitably means homogenization to that group's standards. So I think, this has gone sort of quite beyond the original question you asked me, but, I think to try and tie it in is that, we do have these issues of minorities that we need to be thinking about. But I sometimes get worried about the way that we articulate the problem and the way that we articulate potential solutions to it.
I agree completely with you, and I myself, as you know, come from a diverse background as well. There is half a Hungarian, there is Serbian, there is Montenegrin and Romanian as well, all mixed up in my heritage, family heritage, if you like. So if we're talking about the right to self-determination, or at least the sense of having this right of self-determination, and then coming to the point that this right gets politicized and produces circumstances that ultimately can lead to conflict. How do you see, from your background in conflict mediation, do you see a solution for that? So how can minorities have the right to be who they are and for the society to be diverse, without falling into this trap of being driven into violent or non-violent conflict, because I think there are a number of circumstances where the conflict exists, but it's actually not violent. And then perhaps you think less about those, or they're less obvious, but nevertheless, they exist as a problematic issue.
I think the problem I have is that self-determination becomes so complicated and complex as a concept, and it's evolved in ways that I think many people don't really understand the term. And I often say this, for example, to students, and one of the things since starting the YouTube channel, which I found really interesting, is the way that it reaches out to a much wider audience, and it's horribly abusive at times. For anyone on Twitter, if you think that's bad, try YouTube. But at the same time, the number of times that, it allows me to engage with people who don't come from the narrow academic circle that I will often be in, or the narrow policy circle that I'll be in. And they ask about this question of self-determination. And, the number of times I hear people say, but we have a right to self-determination. We have a right to independence. And having to talk them through how the notion of self-determination, as understood in the UN Charter, and how it's evolved over the past 70 years, and explain that essentially when we talk about self-determination, we have the notion of internal and external self-determination. Now, external is that self-determination which allows peoples to have independence, but it is incredibly narrowly understood now in international relations. It essentially comes down to colonial territories, and there aren't really very many of those left around the world, and or territories that are under military occupation. In all other cases, the notion of self-determination is understood very much in the sense of some sort of autonomy to a greater or lesser extent. The right of peoples living within established states to be able to express some sort of identity. Now, that might mean just simple language rights. It might mean something far more complex, right up to the idea of establishing a federal system or a confederal system. But it doesn't, that internal self-determination doesn't grant a right of independence. And I think a lot of people don't understand this. And this is why, you know, what we see is these sort of secessionist movements, which really very, very rarely will get anywhere. Because states really don't like crossing that boundary between internal to external self-determination, because obviously it creates a very difficult precedent that, given, as I said, that the vast, vast majority of states around the world have those national minorities, tend to shy away from doing. But, and it's a big but, I started to come around to the idea that I think we need to be thinking a little bit more about the notion of self-determination. And that, have we too narrow an understanding of when people should have that right to independence? And I'm a great believer, notwithstanding what I said about that notion of Britishness. I think that, you know, I'm very proud of the fact that Britain has recognised the right of Scotland to have a referendum on its independence. And I think that in a lot of cases, people, when presented with that choice, will really reflect on it. And the strange paradox I think that we've run into is that we're very absolutist in objecting to the right of people to self-determination leading to independence. And yet the societies which are most democratic are the ones most likely to allow people to have the votes. The societies that are the most autocratic are the least likely, and yet they're the people who probably most need it. And I've been meaning to write something, and I've got a long adage, never say something, you know, never reveal an idea if you think someone writes faster than you do. Because this paradox that I've been thinking about for a long time is something that I've wanted to write on. I've never really got round to it, so I've now put it out there. As I say, I think this democracy self-determination paradox, as I say, of people who probably least need self-determination because they live in states that will allow them to express that within an autonomy and a high degree of autonomy within that system. They're the ones who get the right to have independence, and the ones who most need it are the ones who don't, and we stick to that. So I think we really need to be thinking about this whole notion of, it's a huge area, this whole notion of self-determination.
Well, hopefully this will now push you to actually write about it, because your idea is out in the open. But picking up on what you just said, do you think that then people who live in less democratic or autocratic societies feel that they have to turn to other means, such as resorting to violence, to either protect their rights or to claim their rights? And let me ask you about, when it comes to self-determination, take you back to Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, with which you opened this discussion. Presidential candidates in the last elections in Nagorno-Karabakh, they all used self-determination in their discourses and their electoral campaign. So that's a message they're obviously sending strongly to their electorate, but ultimately to 150,000 people who live in Karabakh. And I also want to link another conflict, which is not open at the moment. Some call it frozen, some call it bilateral dispute, which is Kosovo and Serbia, where situation can be perhaps interpreted through a similar or same lens.
You know,
or not?
I think, again, you know, this is where we run into all these difficulties that we've never really truly resolved, because, you know, on the one hand, I was just talking about self-determination, but of course the UN Charter is very specific on the right of the territorial integrity of states. And this is a fundamental clash of these two ideas. And it was partly because states obviously resort to the idea of territorial integrity being more important in many ways, that we have this new evolved idea, or this newer evolved idea, it's quite old now, of internal versus external. So that was the way that you square that circle of saying states have a right to have their borders protected, but at the same time people have the right to self-determination. And it evolved through a number of UN resolutions, General Assembly resolutions, through cases to develop. And I think that this is something that we've seen in a number of conflicts. And of course, in the case of Nagorno-Karabakh, I mean, you know, UN Security Council resolutions had expressed what sort of quite a complex state of affairs, where it recognized that Armenia was occupying Azerbaijan's territory, but at the same time recognizing Nagorno-Karabakh had a right of self-determination. And there was a fundamentally different reading of what that would mean. So Armenia, I think, had always, and the people of Nagorno-Karabakh had always felt that this laid open the opportunity for secession and unification with Armenia. And of course, Azerbaijan had rejected that idea and said, no, this, you know, we will accept it. And it was never entirely clear exactly what that meant in that situation. All it said essentially is that this has to be a negotiated process. So the UN was trying to get people into a situation where you saw a negotiation which wasn't, you know, there wasn't a preordained outcome. There was enough flexibility for the two sides to be able to read that how they wanted. I think when you move over to Serbia and Kosovo, I mean, this as well has been incredibly interesting as an issue to have followed, because of course, you end up in a situation where, and you know, I realize that, you know, it's very difficult terrain to talk about, but Kosovo does stand apart from the traditional way that a lot of these issues were handled. And, you know, that's part of the reason why, you know, the countries that supported Kosovo's independence were using this idea. It's sui generis, it's unique in international politics. And, you know, I've never hidden the fact that I feel distinctly uncomfortable with that as a notion. Now, you know, I can separate that out, you know, and people would often, you know, I was very critical of the way that Kosovo became independent, but that doesn't mean that I'm critical of Kosovo's independence, if you can see the difference, you know. So people would say to me, but how would you feel, you know, if Scotland became independent? Well, I don't have a problem, again, with Scotland having a referendum. But I also have, you know, I understand that the international system works in a particular way, and that, you know, when you start to mess around with that, it can have unintended consequences that aren't necessarily thought through. So, you know, in that case, what we saw is that there were a range of arguments that said, well, Kosovo deserved its independence, it should have it, but it wasn't possible to work within the normal system to do that. And so an exception had to be made, which, as I say, I think was very problematic in many ways. And that, again, isn't to say that I don't think that, you know, Kosovo shouldn't be independent. And now I think, you know, that is essentially beyond doubt. I know some people would argue against it, but I think, you know, even in Serbia, that's essentially recognized. And what we have to do is find a way of getting that regularized and a normalization of relations. But, you know, I don't think we can necessarily lose sight of the complexity of that case, and how that was managed, raised all sorts of very, very serious problems for how we deal with conflicts and how we deal with self-determination, how we deal with secessionist movements. And, you know, but these are just two cases. The other one I work on is Cyprus, and that also throws up a lot of these problems. And I think, you know, one thing I've learned from doing all of this is that, you know, there really aren't simple answers. And you know, I get very, again, coming back to this point, I get very nervous about people who try and present these, as people sometimes do, as black and white, that, you know, one side is in the right, other side is in the wrong, when in actual fact, no, there's a lot of complexity in how we deal with Nagorno-Karabakh. Yes, Armenia occupied Azerbaijan's territory, but Azerbaijan wasn't showing, you know, a lot of, from what I could see, engagement with the idea of, you know, actually giving Nagorno-Karabakh meaningful self-determination as well.
Absolutely. Let me ask you about something else that you mentioned also, frozen conflict. Some analysts like, for example, Tom DeVal or Lawrence Brors, they argued that Nagorno-Karabakh case should not be referred to as a frozen conflict. And there is a, you know, I would say generally among analysts, there is it feels like there is a strong movement towards this idea to denounce the frozen conflict as a concept and as a category. How do you see it from your own work? Is it really a frozen conflict? Is it ever frozen? Is it just a continuous conflict? Is it a strong disagreement which occasionally becomes violent? How would you put it into analytical frame?
Well, you know, I think, you know, as with a lot of these concepts, it can be read in all sorts of different ways. And I mean, Tom and Lawrence are, you know, for anyone who might not be aware of their work, I mean, these are two giants when it comes to sort of working on the South Caucasus. And, you know, I really, you know, I say this absolute sincerity. I mean, they're two people I so respect in their understanding and their knowledge. And so I will, to a certain extent, defer to their view on this. But I actually think that the notion of a frozen conflict is valuable in the sense that it sort of gets across the point that we're not dealing with an immediately hot conflict, a militarized active dispute, but we're not dealing with a situation where there is a peaceful settlement. That what we're dealing with is something that's caught in limbo, which can potentially be open to settlement, but let's not kid ourselves, has the possibility to roll over and become militarized again. And I think that the thing is, as with so many things that we talk about, you know, we're talking about a broad spectrum. You know, it's not discrete categories. And I would always have said that even if I were to class Nagorno-Karabakh as a frozen conflict, which is a term that I would have used, I would always take pains to say, but if you were to ask me which frozen conflict is most likely to blow up, that would have been it. Okay. That it really teetered on the brink. So I think, you know, as a broad category, the idea of frozen conflict is useful, but it's useful to understand that within that, we're talking very, very different. You know, we can refer to Cyprus as a frozen conflict. It hasn't been resolved. The chances of a military confrontation, I think I get worried because accidental military confrontations, you know, can happen. That's something that I'm very aware of on my work on bilateral Greek-Turkish relations, for example. But Cyprus, I would say, is a very low likelihood. You know, the Greek Cypriots are not going to try and do what Azerbaijan tried to do. That's just, you know, and I can remember I once asked a very senior Greek Cypriot politician, I was doing some research, and I said, look, I'm going to have to ask you a question. I know what your answer is going to be, but bear with me. Has the government of Cyprus ever considered trying to retake the north by force? Now, I had to do it as a pro forma question for some research I was doing. And he just burst out laughing. And he said, you know what? No, of course not. That's just crazy to say something like that. You know, but it sort of made the point that that's not, but we always felt, and we could see all the evidence was there, that Azerbaijan was spending a lot of money, and it was very clear where this was headed. So yeah, I think, you know, frozen conflict has a value, but, you know, we need to think of it in broad terms.
Let me ask you something else, because you're a practitioner as much as an academic, and you just mentioned talking to a senior official. How much academics, a lot of the academics do tend to try to be to pick up the nuances of different conflicts and of different situations when it comes to minorities, majorities, relations, etc. How much sensitivity, in your experience, is among the other side, being policymakers and senior politicians, to the same nuances, and to what extent would you say are they open and capable of accepting this analysis, which is quite far from black and white? In other words, how do we translate this great understanding of how conflict emerges or persists to those who actually have influence to do something about it?
Do you know, this is something that I've thought a lot about over my career, because I've seen the very difficult relationship that academics and policymakers often have. And, I think, there's a tendency amongst many academics to dismiss policymakers. They're not interested in academic writing. They don't want to engage with academic debate. I think the problem is that many policymakers, they live in a world where they're very acutely aware of what is and isn't possible politically. And they're the ones who actually have to put things into action. And I think the trouble is that many academics will engage with policymakers and start talking theory and start spouting about, as so-and-so said and as so-and-so said, and that just does not work in policy circles. They want to get, they don't have time. They work in a very, very different world. It's very fast, and we can say, look, this isn't the way it should be done, but this is the way that it is done. They want very clear language. They want to get right to the heart of the problem immediately, and sometimes present it in ways that, we would think is not particularly nuanced. But one thing I can say is, my experience a few years ago, I ended up working at the Foreign Office, on the Cyprus settlement talks, is that I think there's also a tendency, if I'm to be honest, that many academics, we like to think we're incredibly smart, smarter than ordinary people. And I think that's a failing of ours, because one of the things I've really discovered, and I sort of knew it, but I saw it close up, how incredibly bright a lot of the people who work in policy circles are. And I think sometimes we think we're better than them. And no, we're not. They've just taken a different route, and they're using their intelligence in a very different way to the way that we are. And they're capable of taking things on. But again, they're working within particular confines and particular strictures, which mean that they have to approach things. And I think if I was to say anything, I think it's less incumbent on policymakers to try and understand us as academics, and far more important that us as academics learn how to communicate more effectively to policymakers, and realize that, we have to try and enter into their world for all sorts of reasons, for right or for wrong. They're not really, sometimes you'll meet ones who will try and engage in the academic world, and that's wonderful when you do see that. But a lot of time they're just too busy, focused on very quick decision making, having to make very serious decisions, and don't have that time to be quite as ponderous on things. So, I think we have to get better at communicating.
I absolutely agree with you. And obviously, when it comes to saving people's lives or resolving very difficult emergencies, the decision-making process has to be guided by different ideas and different intentions. For the end, I want to kind of take us back to the beginning, but also emphasize something else. We live in the globalized world. And obviously, when we talk about conflict and minorities, a lot of the conflicts we talked about in this conversation are localized. And yet, when you start digging in a bit more and when you analyze them, then there is influence of one country or another. In Nagorno-Karabakh, there is Turkey, there is Russia. And globalized world is moving at a specific pace, if you like. So how do you see, so the conflicts, they don't go untouched by the bigger sphere of where we live. How do you see this influence, and is there a genuine care about preventing conflict in a globalized world?
Oh, a tough one to end with. Oh my. Yeah, look, I mean, I think that
I think you have the perspective, you know, you have the experience, and I think
you know what, putting me on the spot, I think the problem is that, you know, it's finding the balance. There are far too many conflicts which have no international attention, and then there are ones which are far too much, if you see what I mean. The outside actors get involved. So, you know, we can point to any number of small, very localized conflicts, which are nevertheless very bloody, very brutal, which go completely ignored and might not take a lot of effort by the international community to address them. And yet that's just not happening. And then, of course, you've got those other conflicts, which then become battlegrounds for all sorts of wider interests, whether it's Russian, whether it's European, whether it's Turkish, you know, or whatever. And so I think, you know, this is an incredibly difficult balance to find and to address, because you can't just say, well, I wish it wasn't this way, because that's the way it is. And then you have to think, right, okay, if we're going to resolve this, how do we bring Moscow in, you know, or how do we bring Ankara in? And that then opens up a whole set of other debates. And then you start getting into quite difficult bargaining, which is, I think, sometimes not always really understood as to how complex it gets, you know, and the trade-offs that are needed. But I think on a bigger point, that's something that I've really been thinking about a lot recently, is this sense that we still have too many legacy conflicts on the international agenda. And what do I mean by that? I mean, you know, I was very aware in 2017 with the UN talks on Cyprus. So, you know, I was there and the Secretary General turned up. And I remember thinking to myself, you know, it would be really interesting for somebody from New York to put together an A4 side with all the world issues that are on the UN's agenda, and where the Cyprus problem would fall on that. And that's not to belittle Cyprus at all. It's, you know, I've worked on the Cyprus issue for 30 years. It's a fundamental and integral part of my life, personally and professionally. But we live in a world now where there are so many major issues that we've got to try and tackle. You know, obviously we talk about climate change, but we talk about energy resources, energy scarcity. You know, we talk about, you know, other types of resources, disappearing island states, you know, all of these things that we have to be very aware of. And we have a number of issues like Cyprus, and also things like Kosovo, Serbia, things like Bosnia, which really there isn't, to use a term that policymakers use, the bandwidth to be able to focus on all these different factors. And these are issues which we really need to try and solve, but it's incumbent upon the politicians and on the societies themselves to realize that, frankly, the world's got bigger things it really and desperately needs to be focusing on. And I don't know if we communicate that message effectively enough, and how we can leverage that. And I think that what we're seeing this year in 2020 with COVID will focus attention much more on this. That there was, you know, and I know it's very cliched, but you can talk of a pre-COVID and a post-COVID world, and how that pays out, whether it's going to be greater or lesser extent, you know, we just don't know. But even before that, we could all see that there were a number of issues which were rising up on the list of priorities. I think that this might mark a break. And how now do we deal with those legacy issues? And I think we need to try and think of really ways of addressing them and putting them to bed, so that we can really spend all the focus where that focus, for all of our sakes, really needs to, you know, we need to concentrate on dealing with.
I agree with you completely. Thank you very much, James, for being my guest in this episode of ECMI Conversations with Experts series. And not just for that, but really for staying committed to your work and what you have been doing for the past decades, and for not giving up, and for staying optimistic and engaging in all these difficult situations and unresolved conflicts that you have been working on. And we hope that you will join us on other activities at ECMI.
Okay. Thank you very, very much again for the very kind invitation. It's been lovely talking to you.
Have a good day.